All right. So good afternoon, everyone. We're going to do some formalities here. Thanks for coming. Your time, obviously, is very valuable, and we really appreciate your attendance. So welcome to our second presentation for the BSc Historical Criminological Network Winter Seminar Series, Meet the Authors. Today we have a fantastic presentation by Professor Geoff Ward. Just as a starting point, the series in general welcomes presentations, as you guys know, but to do a refresher from research in progress, research completed, and research published. So today we have Geoff, who joins us from Washington. Sorry, let me go back to my notes here.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that. Let's see.
Okay, good.
Yes, it's very clear. Okay, so Geoff comes to us today from Washington University in St. Louis, where he's professor of African and African American Studies and faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology and American Cultural Studies program. He is importantly the director of the Wazoo and Slavery Project, a university initiative based in the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, in partnership with a consortium of universities studying slavery. His research, his scholarship examines histories and legacies of racialized violence and their reparative implications. This work has been generously supported by institutions including the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Justice, the Ford Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. So in addition to numerous research articles and essays, he's the author of The Black Child Savers, Racial Democracy and Juvenile Justice, an award-winning book. And actually, this is the book that brought Geoff to my attention. And his work so importantly sort of brought light to my own work as I struggled to complete my PhD. So before we start today, just a brief note on conduct. I would like to take the opportunity to remind everyone of the need for self-awareness in how we treat the space. The aim is to establish a safe space for intellectual exchange. So please be mindful and treat each other with respect and dignity as a starting point for inclusivity. So the session is recorded today. So I just want you guys to know that if you're not comfortable with this, I invite you to use the feature at the wall. So you can use just go behind the wall and use the chat function as a way to communicate. We do encourage communication. So the aim is for the sessions to be interactive between speakers and audiences. So there are a number of ways you can do this. There's an opportunity to engage at the end of the talk. You can use either or both the chat function and the hand raise function. You can write where you're coming from, where you're tuning in from in the chat, and just give us a sense of your interest in this topic and in historical criminology itself. It's a very important, I think, feature to just get a sense of why you're tuning in. This platform, I think, is a very useful one. While face-to-face is very important and useful, I think sometimes we don't really have the time, given time constraints that we have these days, to travel and engage as much as we can. So having a virtual space, I think, is very, very good. So at this time, without taking up too much room and too much space, I'll hand over to Geoff, who will give his presentation on race, youth, and history.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for joining me. I was excited to get the invitation in part because I thought I might get to come to England. But then I saw Zoom and I thought, okay, well, you got to start somewhere. So, but no, it's great. It's great that we have the capacity to be together virtually and to share the work. I appreciate the interest, Dr. Miller, in inviting me to share with the workshop. So what I was invited to do was talk about some how, in my experience with the study of juvenile justice and the African American experience, how an historical lens contributes to a more nuanced analysis of race and justice, not only in the U.S. context but potentially globally. And I want to leave some time for conversation, because I'm interested in the global question. I haven't studied myself race and youth justice globally, but I do hope to do that, and to learn from what other scholars are doing. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the issues I ran into that really led to. I didn't intend to do an historical analysis of the juvenile justice system in the U.S. at all, really. But I very quickly, in the course of developing my dissertation, realized that it was essential to do that. And I'll say more about that in a second. But the sort of key points here are that I had been sort of led into this question of, the nature of race and how race affects the administration of youth justice. I had been somewhat unwittingly kind of oriented by this distributive way of thinking about race, exclusively distributive. Racial equity is about equal distributions of outcomes, or distributions of goods, the social goods. And I quickly learned, as I'll share in a second, that was a misleading way of thinking about this history. And that led to and that plus some early discoveries regarding the African American experience in juvenile justice made it clear that it was essential to really focus on the long view to advance research in this area.
Guys, I'm getting some feedback. Could you perhaps mute your microphones? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's Benson's deals on so I'll talk a bit about that and about what I've come to view as some of the benefits of an historical analysis of Black youth justice and some of the methods I used in doing that to produce the Black child savers. So what I was planning to do a study. I don't know if this is the case in UK or other contexts people may be familiar with, but the US had introduced this technology in courts called structured decision making that was supposed to eliminate bias by routinizing the kinds of questions that are being asked around cases and assigning numbers to, do you have two parents in the household? That's worth, to produce these risk scores and need scores, and these risk and need assessment instruments were being touted as, colorblind and race neutral, and ways to ensure that bias did not affect the administration of justice. And I sort of thought instinctively that was a bunch of garbage, that is not possibly how those instruments are going to be working, in part because the questions are going to be racialized. They're going to be loaded with valuations and sorts of things that are at the very least affected by class dynamics, which are in this country and globally intermingled with dynamics around race and ethnicity. So I was going to look at whether disproportionate minority confinement in youth institutions was diminished by the introduction of these instruments in courts. And my intention was to just do, with respect to historical work, was to just do like a page on the, maybe a few pages at most on the historical backdrop of disproportionate minority confinement, which this graphic illustrates. And basically I wanted to make this graph and then write about it. And I made the graph and I thought, well, this is interesting. How is it the case that there was that the most proportionate confinement of non-white youth in U.S. juvenile institutions existed in 1890, a year that in a decade that is known through African-American history scholarship as the Black nadir, the lowest point in Black-white race relations in the United States post-emancipation, because it's the era when the white supremacist redeemers, the people who have fought to topple the Reconstruction and reinstate white supremacy, are running rampant around the country and taking back the government and so forth. So I thought this cannot possibly be the moment when there was the most equity in the youth justice system. So I thought, well, what? So I thought, well, I need to know what was going on in the 19th and early 20th century with respect to race and youth justice. And I should say this fixation on distributive sort of ways of thinking about youth justice was really driven by this mandate by the federal government in 1992 for states to address DMC, disproportionate minority confinement, the disparity between the percent non-white youth in institutions and the percent non-white in the population. And that really incentivized, funding was tied to the state's response to this federal initiative, and it really incentivized, institutionalized thinking about equity in a narrowly distributive way. So I went looking, what is there about the early history of race and juvenile justice in the United States context that can help make sense of this misleading portrait that comes from looking at the previous graph. And one of the things I found is a really valuable document. I meant to add the source here in case you were interested, but it's a government document on historical crime statistics in the United States. And I produced this graph and, showing that the vast majority of Black youth who were confined to institutions were in adult institutions in 1910. That's why they weren't in the youth justice, the juvenile institutions. 71% of all Black youth committed to institutions in 1910 were committed to adult institutions, as compared to 31% of white youth, which essentially means that the diffusion of this sort of enlightened model of juvenile justice, the rehabilitative ideal and the associated institutions, was being selectively experienced by white youth. And this is, as you can see from the regional breakdown, largely a story of related to the Jim Crow South, where the vast majority of African Americans live until the middle 20th century. And there, more than 8 out of 10 incarcerated Black youth are in adult institutions. And in this, I'll show you in a moment, this doesn't typically mean prisons at that time. It means things like convict lease camps and other kinds of horrific, brutal ordeals. Very small numbers of Black youth are institutionalized in other parts of the country. And in those places, there is relative parity with white youth. I think in part because their confinement in the juvenile institutions didn't require the development of separate and unequal kinds of, juvenile reformatories. There were just very small numbers of Black kids being committed. So anyway, this is, so I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I kept finding these little pieces of information. And I didn't know how to do an historical analysis of anything, really. I mean, my undergraduate degree was in sociology. I was getting a PhD in sociology. I had not taken historical methods. But I just sort of, I think what a lot of historians do, I emulated works by historians. I really historically engaged social scientists like W.E.B. Du Bois, who I really admired, and thought about this logically and how can I answer these questions. And where I started was really just building piles of material that had anything to do with the racial history of juvenile justice specifically, or even sort of contextually. And I made this, I got a big sketchbook, and I had all this stuff in my apartment in grad school. I thought, okay, I had piles of articles. I had notes about this and that, and I decided to make sense of before I go crazy and just sort of abandon ship with this project. I need to make sense of this material. Which I wanted to think about relationally and temporally, spatially, temporally, and otherwise relationally. And so I decided I would essentially chart the collected material on a timeline. And I know you can't see very well what's happening here, but here's 1800, here's 2000. And down here are major historical events. So this is more contextual, like the end of Reconstruction and the first Black Reformatory and the start of World War I and all kinds of things like that. Way down here are these eras: chattel slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, migration begins, migration grows, Great Depression, etc. And what this really helped me do was think about kind of how the politics of race are changing over time, and that is translating into not only experiences of youth, but Black community mobilization around issues of youth justice. Obviously this, I didn't just then kind of write this up. It really helped me see stories, threads, pathways that I began to focus more on and develop analytically in what became the book. It became the dissertation first, and then the book. And the reason the entries kind of tail off after 1960 is because I kind of abandoned this method at this point and was starting to really, at that point, was more focused on more specific questions and finding resources and so forth. So, obviously I consulted a lot of different archives and some official data, and secondary sources were crucial, to pull out of the shadows the experiences of and interventions of Black youth and communities in the history of American juvenile justice. Methodologically, I was really drawn to the work of William Sewell, who's a sociologist who wrote a book called The Logics of History, so thinking about history as a social force, and this idea of evenemental sociology, whereby structures are continually being transformed or reconfigured by social action, and that social action is at the center of the inquiry. And there's a sort of path dependency. I'll give you an example of this. In the book I write about I'll talk about the Black child savers more in a moment, but these women primarily women who over generations mobilized to dismantle Jim Crow juvenile justice, you see them shifting to pressure group politics and the use of the vote to affect outcomes in juvenile justice, as migration is bringing, moving people into northern cities where there's relatively greater access to the vote, and as women gain the right to vote in the United States. You see that strategy emerging in those places at that time. This is an evenemental kind of, dynamic compared to in places in the Deep South still at the same time, where the movement is kind of still looking as it had decades before. One of the I guess the two things I want to stress about the argument of the Black child savers, vis-a-vis how we need to understand the racial history of juvenile justice. And one is that this kind of liberal democratic notion of the modern juvenile justice system as a manufactory of citizens. This idea that the raw material of wayward youth could be reshaped and molded like human clay into normal and productive civic actors. All of that lofty liberal sort of liberal democratic rhetoric collided with the idea that America was a white country. And that, in fact, the first picture here of Dred and Harriet Scott outside the old courthouse references the Scott v. Sanford decision which held in 1857 that African Americans were not, the Supreme Court decision held that African Americans were not contemplated as citizens by the founders of the nation, by the authors of the Constitution, and therefore had no rights that whites were bound to respect. That notion of America as a white country collides with the idea of American juvenile justice as a citizen-building institution and helps to rationalize the withholding of those resources and protections from Black children. But more importantly, the denial of power to Black Americans, prevented them from, within and over the arms of the parental state. So Black Americans are disenfranchised generally, but also with respect to the idea and practice of American juvenile justice. They are not represented in the legislatures, they're not represented on the judiciary, among probation officers and police, school officials. All of the arbiters of juvenile justice are white. The official arbiters are white, and this is essentially creating a white parental state that is really crucial to understanding the racial history of juvenile justice. Combined with that is this idea that Black people are actually not fully human. Now, this is this fundamental white supremacist idea that whiteness is whiteness and humanity are sort of intricately bound, and non-whites are less than full persons. This idea collides, of course, with the notion of human clay, the notion of the youth, of the child and adolescent as a uniquely impressionable, salvageable, malleable type of human that can be intentionally shaped and molded according to the benevolent agenda of the rehabilitative ideal. There was a person ran for governor, I think of Arkansas, one of our southern states, who pledged not to invest a single dollar in in a Negro reformatory, was his term, because a Negro reformatory is a contradiction in terms. This is the racist ideology that is coupled with white monopoly on power that is institutionalizing unequal protection in the context of youth justice. And this anti-Blackness was normative. It wasn't like there were just these like radical white people in power. It was normative. It informed things like nursery rhymes and board games and all kinds of popular media were peddling this notion of, peddling this idea that African Americans and other people of color are inferior, trivializing Black life and so forth, and suffering. Literally, in the case of this nursery rhyme, 10 Little Indians, which became 10 Little N-words in this iteration, and it's teaching children to count through the one by one sort of killing of Black children. This is so in other words, the nation is socializing, routinely socializing young people and everyone, all of us to see Black people as something else, and then fully human and fully deserving of the kinds of investments that would that are implied in the idea of rehabilitation. And again, this is normative, it's global. I mean, Agatha Christie's 10 Little Indians, 10 Little N-Words, here's this play. At the top center of this slide is from England, actually. But you see the board game where you shoot the black kids, one by one. So this is the context of the emergence of the Jim Crow juvenile justice system. And I should say, one of the things I think was really beneficial to me in the course of this journey was that I had not studied criminology at all. And I came into this really from more of a social movements background. So I wasn't burdened by all of the canon of criminology and the ways of thinking about data, where I came to learn later, these kinds of things are typically not considered used as data sources by criminologists. When I took positions in departments of criminology earlier in my career. So these are the examples of the kinds of things I was finding. And this is just to illustrate how this notions around race shape the administration of justice. This is a view of the House of Refuge in the earliest juvenile reformatory institutions this was in Philadelphia, and you can see the top part of the institution is the Department for White Children. The bottom is the view of the Department for African American children, and there's a wall around the institution for African American children. This is the same House of Refuge, but these separate departments, segregated departments. And when I saw the wall, I thought, oh, this must be to prevent escape or something like that. But no, I found the superintendent's letters, and he explained that the wall was to protect white children from the realization that they were being confined alongside Black children because it'd be harmful to them to know that they were associated with beings given to such public scorn. The beings who'd been dehumanized and disrespected routinely and so forth through the material I was showing you previously. They didn't want white kids that would be counter to their rehabilitation as white kids. White kids in this institution were taught various trades in addition to regular academic subjects. Black children were enlisted in tasks like cleaning and cooking in anticipation of their future in a kind of in a stratified labor market where they were expected to become servants and domestics and so forth. So these were ordeals of Jim Crow juvenile justice. That was a northern version of it. In the deep South, it was brutal ordeals like the convict lease system, and where mortality rates were very high, where there were no even pretenses to a separate system. You see this bottom picture is Black kids in prison stripes, which are stigmatizing, meant to be eliminated through the innovations in juvenile justice. Engaged in arduous agricultural work, essentially a reiteration of the logic of slavery. And the Black women I write about say that they saw scenes like this when in the 1890s, and that led them to mobilizing around the dismantling of Jim Crow juvenile justice. It was the sight of Black children on work gangs that moved them. Here's some scenes from Memphis, Tennessee in 1914, just 4 years after the previous photo. In Memphis is a city in Tennessee. You had separate Black and white juvenile courts. The white court is at the bottom, a former school building, modern technology, furniture making workshop, all sorts of things for troubled white youth. The Black court was in a shotgun shack in the Black district of Memphis with an open sewer in the back. And the judge refused to come over to the Black court, so a police officer served as judge, which is not consistent with our constitutional guarantees of due process. But in Memphis, you have people like Julia Hooks. I learned about Julia Hooks and her husband, who volunteered as probation officers to counter these separate and unequal conditions. You know, Julia and her husband put that plant on the porch of the Black court, an attempt to sort of, bring some dignity to the space. They created opportune programs for Black kids. They essentially attempted to fill the void. And these women like Julia Hooks were altogether absent in these classic works on the child savers. Who were the child savers? So this was obviously one of the texts that I turned to early on when I was starting to look into the long view of juvenile justice. And you wouldn't know that there was a Black population in the United States reading the child savers, really, with the exception of its appendix discussing English common law and executions in the early history of the United States, where they note the executions of Black youth. And you can see from these quotes that these several scholars, including Tony Platt, who's become a dear friend and was a mentor and a reader for my manuscript. So I'm not, personalizing the critique here. I'm just saying that this work, these were really white studies. These are studies of juvenile justice in the white experience, not labeled as such. And I would say that this is typical of the historiography of probably all of our institutions, but certainly the historiography of the criminal legal system, in part because it is dependent upon the records that are most available. The stories of that sketchbook I showed you before. I mean, that was really result of digging deeper for like what is out there that could potentially inform an historical reading of juvenile justice where African Americans are at the center. And it required going around the sort of mainstream institutional records and so forth, and finding these glimpses of things. But these arguments, these scholars argued that this was a conservative movement. It was led by women who were kind of bored and who saw opportunity in to move out of the private sphere into the public sphere through work with around children, that it was a story of class domination, gender subjugation. And I don't, none of that I think is entirely wrong, but it omits the story of in many ways the contrasting case of the Black child savers, who who mobilized in two waves, I've argued in this book, generally speaking, two waves of the movement. An initial movement that was more modest, led by women who, part of these clubs, National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and their local chapters, were really focused on lessening the harm of this separate and unequal system, by doing things like creating their own reformatories, buying a house and then going to the court and saying, we have a new reformatory, please don't send our children to prison anymore, send them to us, we'll do the rehabilitative ideal ourselves. Teaching trades. These are pictures from around 1915 in Louisiana, wagon making and seamstress trainings, teaching kids marketable skills that might also contribute to their mobility economically, socially. Still, though, this is in the context of a Jim Crow, American apartheid period, and you had grave threats facing Black children accused of crime, such as the Scottsboro boys, who were nearly executed for after being falsely accused of a crime in Alabama in 1931. There were, in fact, numerous executions of Black youth, and disproportionately executions of Black youth. And again, inconsistent with the story of juvenile justice as this kind of enlightenment that proceeds gradually but consistently over the course of the 20th century. You see that for Black kids, the experience of execution is increasing, proportionally speaking, over time. By the time you get to the late juvenile court movement period, by which point there are juvenile courts in every state, and seemingly this institution is fully developed. You have over 8 out of 10 executed Black youth are African American. So this is a ordeal that is increasingly mobilizing people in the United States and to some extent globally. I found some examples of international outrage at the contradictions of American juvenile justice relative to American claims of claims to being a beacon of freedom and so forth. And so this is really galvanizing folks by the mid 20th century, is galvanizing folks and leading to a new, in part leading to a new wave of Black child saving intervention that is also shaped by the changing circumstances and from in social movement terms, the changing nature of the resources that Black communities can mobilize to affect change in the idea and practice of juvenile justice. So things like the I mentioned before, migration to the urban north, but also increased access to power through the more robust civil rights establishment that's emerging, the NAACP, these other organizations, also various professions like law and psychology and other fields that are being leveraged to affect change here. And so the agenda is shifting from, dampening the harm to really dismantling this Jim Crow system and remaking it in the image of a multiracial democracy. Judge Jane Bolin is an amazing figure, who I learned about in this research, who really symbolizes this transition. She is affecting change from her position on the bench, which she held for 40 years. And is also one of the few women directors of the NAACP, and she's really leveraging both of these positions of power and influence to affect change, especially in the New York context. These reformers had this, really romantic idea about what they could achieve through what some of their contemporaries called race expert leadership. And essentially the idea was that they could institutionalize equal justice through the working together of this network of differentially sort of situated leaders, in the legal policy realm and direct services, community organizing, intellectual, political, that if this, I write about it as a surrogate parental state that's being sort of developed on the margins of the juvenile justice system. But the idea was that you could essentially install this and this kind of network of professional and community leadership that in the mainstream of juvenile justice that would normalize things like equal access to resources and protection, et cetera. There were warning signs, though, and some of this I think I found, for example, I don't remember this is in the book, but I found W.E.B. Du Bois makes this warning, and this is really this view, I call it romantic in part because it didn't come to pass. The history played out quite differently, but Du Bois made this really prescient observation in 1930. I think he was like pissed off at kid. He was in a city. I think he was living in New York City at the time, and he was angry about these kids who were, just causing problems on the street. Minor, adolescent stuff. But he wrote that, that he was, beyond that sort of frustration, that there's this, growing problem of Black urban delinquency, and that if it was not addressed, there would be what he called a twofold catastrophe. One is that on the dominant group reaction, which would be the white population's reaction, would be to incarcerate young people at a higher rate. And that would have a couple of consequences. One is intensifying the actual severity of crime among young people and young adults, because incarceration, his argument was incarceration is criminogenic and alienating in terms of other things like educational and labor market opportunities. And that this would further fragment and weaken Black civil society and collective efficacy. So in other words, it was going to draw a wedge, he said, between the Black poor and marginalized elements of the Black community and the more affluent, say, middle class elements of Black communities. They would not, their collective efficacy would be degraded. The likelihood of seeing each other's interests as their own and working together to address them would be diminished. You would instead have within group animus, and that would be devastating in terms of the ability to continue to advance things like African American economic and political and social well-being. So, he predicted by about 50 years earlier what comes to a head in the 1980s. The rise of this moral panic around super predators and the sort of shuttering of the idea of the juvenile justice system as a manufactory of citizens, we're replacing it with this more retributive model of juvenile justice as African Americans are finally gaining power and influence and protection, formally speaking, within the context of the once, more child and social welfare oriented juvenile justice system. It's sort of a story of the integration of a sinking ship, essentially. And you can see, this, for example, this is from an article in the LA Times titled "Learning to Read in Cages." There are children in these cages being taught to read in a juvenile reformatory in my hometown, Los Angeles, which is, contrary to the idea of the enlightened juvenile justice system and to protect the best interests of young people and so forth, or best practices for reading education. But this is where we found ourselves in the 1980s, and I'm trying to think of adjectives. I'll just leave the adjectives off of it. the Donald, brought out this full-page ad calling for the death penalty in the wake of the Central Park jogger case, where 5 Black and Latino youth had already been arrested. So he was essentially calling for the killing of these youth. In this kind of tough on crime pledge that was an early indicator of his intention to move into government on a far right political agenda. So this is the new Jim Crow, to use the title of the book, the new Jim Crow juvenile justice emerges in this post-integration context. There's essentially a retraction of the benefits that generations of Black women in particular had been fighting to gain access to, the opportunities and resources and influence that they had fighting to get to, is being withdrawn through this reconstruction of what juvenile justice systems are and who they're for. And it wasn't a complete abandonment of juvenile justice. It was really a development of a two-pronged system, one prong being for youth still deserving of protection and so forth, and another group of youth undeserving of protection and for whom the idea of childhood would be forfeited, to use one governor's term. The serious quote unquote delinquent. So let me close just by kind of coming back to where I started with this timeline and graphic, and really what this graphic I came to learn over the course of this research, really what it tells us about is the evolution of exclusion over time in relation to shifting social and institutional dynamics. In the first half of the 20th century, into the late 19th, into the early 20th, into the first half of the 20th century, you have this sort of peak emergence and peak optimism around the idea of a liberal liberal democratic approach to addressing children in trouble, and over that span of time, African American children and other non-white children are being systematically excluded relative to white children who are privileged, prioritized. Even white immigrant, I should say, white immigrant children were specifically, Irish girls, were of particular interest to these early reformers in the first part of the American juvenile justice system's history. And they were described frequently as these figures who could be rehabilitated into whiteness, into sort of they were racialized as inferior in the context of the U.S. Sort of dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestant framings of European immigrants, including the Irish, were that they were inferior, but because they had this trace of Europeanness, the argument went, they were salvageable more so than Black children, and their salvation should be prioritized because they would be progenitors of the white polity into the future. Was the argument that was made. So these youth were the focal point of this early period. As the rehabilitative ideal declines, in part, first through, I didn't talk about this for time's sake, but in first due to liberal concerns that the rehabilitative ideal was an abuse of power, that in fact, children did not benefit from this institutionalization. They were probably harmed, and that they were entitled to more due process protection. This was an initial wave of reform that dismantles the traditional juvenile justice system beginning in the 1950s and 60s. as that's happening, white kids are being moved out. They're being deinstitutionalized. They are disproportionately benefiting from the increased concern about the due process protections, the potential harm of juvenile institution, and their spaces are being filled by non-white youth in terms of proportions represented in these institutions. And then finally, we get to this punitive turn when non-white youth overtake dramatically, and you can see from 1980 to 1990, this dramatic uptick in the proportion non-white coincides with this punitive turn I've talked about, including the moral panic around super predators. You know, Judge Boland's tenure, I mentioned being a big fan. Judge Boland her tenure coincides with this abandonment of the rehabilitative ideal and restructuring of juvenile justice, such that by the, in her oral history, she talks about how at the end of her career, she became sort of disillusioned and saddened by the nation's apparent abandonment of the project of juvenile justice, particularly as Black and Latino youth are concerned. All that she had fought for over these many years. She spent her whole year on the juvenile court bench, which was unusual for judges in this country. They typically spend a little bit of time in the juvenile court and then move on to other kind of more prestigious judicial positions. But she was really saddened by this turn. So let me just end with some basic summary points about the more nuanced view. One is, I think that the long view provides an empirical evidence of the limitations of a distributive paradigm for thinking about the meaning of race and the meaning of racial equity, a racial ethnic group equity in the context of youth justice, and informs alternative theoretical and policy perspectives. The focus on proportions of institutional outcomes is limited in a number of respects, but these include disregard for qualitative experiences of unequal justice, which the Philadelphia Refuge illustrates. Even if children are being proportionally committed to those institutions, the conditions of those institutions were drastically different. The meaning of institutionalization was drastically different. Proportionality also, and in terms of confinement, also overlooks very important questions of power and community well-being, of representative government, and so forth that have to be taken into consideration, I think, when we're talking about the question of equal justice. So, and this is why in my subsequent work, I really started to focus more on this idea of racially democratic social control and representation among legal authorities and what it adds up to in terms of outcomes and so those sorts of things, because I was really still interested in thinking about equal justice not only as a kind of negative right, a right to not be subject to discrimination, but a positive right to representation in the administration of justice. And people will say, and let's just end here, people will say, well, we've had representatives in government and it doesn't change anything. But at least in this country, there has never been, in fact, a representative criminal legal system, in part because the most powerful figures, the legislatures, the judiciaries have not been representative. Where you find representation is typically among the greatest representation is typically among lower level decision makers and those who are tasked with carrying out the policies that are made by the most powerful legal authorities in the country. So I will stop there, and hope we have some time to talk a bit about this if you're interested.
Thank you very, very much for that, Geoff. It was fantastic. It created, wow, I'm not sure where to start. I will find a place though. It just strikes me as so interesting that the the cross section of themes that you cover are so relevant to the narratives that we're hearing today, like the return for and the sort of the doubling down of calls for a challenge to those notions about liberal neutrality, about the ideas of proportionality being universal, about the modern project, alongside the sort of the more specific American dream, that this was extremely racialized, despite the discussions. Especially, I remember in my post, much like you, my background is not in criminology, but I benefit from coming outside of criminology, having done political theory and history. But I do remember key conversations in political theory, the discussions around the idea of a system in place to protect everyone, a system of universal rights, and a challenge to anyone who suggested that neutrality was a distortion of the reality. It strikes me, for instance, that the project of the left and right, which we see emerging out of the war on drugs and war on crime, seem very much to be consistently racialized. So whilst the left were asking for due process and the right were calling for the death penalty, like Wilson and his cohort, they were still resulting in the greater racialization of the system, where we see like the meting out of punishment to the I borrow a lot from the vocabulary of malleability that I take from the reform movements, especially those that were coming out of the UK. The idea that we were initially, when we separated youth justice from the adult system, we were thinking of youth as malleable. And then alongside that, we see the paradox of the exclusion of the racialized youth, and the idea of intractability emerged from that. The idea that, sure, we were talking about malleability, but only insofar as it had to do with those outside the category of Blackness. So, and I'm also struck by the idea of erasures. So the erasure of efforts by those of advocacy, for instance, of those like Boland, and the sort of desperation in Du Bois's critique or commentary, his observation of the urban youth. And you see this because you draw on this sort of fantastic interdisciplinary body of work. So I'm thinking of Gwendolyn Brooks, a similar observation, but far more sympathetic, in her poem To the Young Who Want to Die. And she was basically saying, well, you may as well just enjoy yourself and go for it. Just go big or go home. And I wonder where has the efforts of those like the Black child savers, where have they landed really? Like, where are they now? What can we say about them?
Yeah. Well, first I have to say, I've been kind of an itinerant scholar. I've been interested in things and then I've moved on to other things, typically in a path-dependent way. Like I mentioned, I moved from the study, and these things take forever. The book I took like 10 years writing this book, and after the dissertation, but I was doing other research on, and so all that's to say, I haven't really kept a close eye on that question. I have been intrigued. I mean, I've been invited to, I get invited to speak with like at continuing legal education conferences for juvenile defense lawyers, for example. They who are interested, who are dealing in the trenches, dealing with these issues I ended with. The unequal youth justice system in the context of formal integration, and they're having to represent these kids who are facing charges that could lead them to prison for many, many years, and so I know that there are contemporaries of the Black child savers in all of our communities. There are people who are fighting to make these systems work for people who they haven't been designed to work well for, or at least to protect them from the gravest threats that these institutions pose. I find in those, in those conversations that the work is both, that this, being introduced to this longer view is kind of depressing for people, but also inspiring, because, I've women, for example, who are probation officers, who are really in the trenches, they're dealing with on a client level and family level, dealing with these issues. They've come up to me and said, thank you for giving me some motivation to keep going, because it's hard and I often want to quit, but I see myself in Julia Hooks, the Angel of Beale Street from 1914. But I shouldn't have to but we shouldn't still be fighting that fight. They also say it's a depressing in that sense. I don't believe that there's been a great deal of impact of this work, unfortunately, in terms of the way the formal system has been organized, or thinking about measuring equity, in part because the arguments I'm making here are so misaligned with the conservative politics around race and justice, which have been at the sort of, in retrospect, a sort of high point here was in a way, well, I shouldn't say that, but there was this deep investment in color blindness, right? Colorblind racial ideology, which is antithetical to the idea of representative social control. I mean, one of the ironies I write about in the book is how I come back to the need and risk assessment instruments that are being given to these decision makers. And we have this diversity rhetoric. Well, we value diversity and inclusion. It brings diverse perspectives to bear and insights and empathy. But that coincided with the introduction of these standardized decision-making tools that are meant to prevent people from expressing the insights and empathy and all sorts of things that diversity was meant to bring. So, our countries are, I think England is very similar in some of these respects. I'm not as closely familiar with it, but, there's this sort of schizophrenia about the way we talk about diversity and how we love it and value it, but also try to mute it. In important ways. I should say this last thing in response to what's happening. I mentioned going in other directions. One direction was looking at the significance of representation among legal authorities, and I did a number of papers related to that. And the other was looking at the legacy of racial violence, which is also an outgrowth of this project. These women mobilized, the Black Child Savers, saw this as a genocidal institution that was, they used that language, that was, they said, quote, killing the seeds of a people, essentially underdeveloping, by denying Black youth selectively opportunities for full self-realization. The institution was projecting into the future collective Black economic, political, social disadvantage. And that's what they meant. Although there was also literally killing through executions. They were really talking about diminished life chances that would have collective community impacts into the future. And that really got me interested in thinking about the legacies of historical racial violence, and why I moved more to looking at histories of slavery and lynching and other racialized violence that we can measure and examine more closely in terms of contemporary outcomes.
Thank you for that. Guys, don't forget you can write your questions in the chat, or you can use your hand raise function. I see that Kira has a question in the chat. Thank you for that, Kira. So you say, thanks so much for the fascinating talk, Geoff. I'm blown away by the huge array of primary source material you drew upon. And then the question, was there any particular archive or collection of source material that proved especially useful for your research? And she asked 3 questions. So I'll just read through and then I'll give you the chance to respond. Did any of the source material offer any intersectional lens, etc.? Example, the experiences of African American youths with disabilities. And did you encounter any silences in the archives on aspects of youth justice history in the African American experience? So the first question, was there any particular archive or collection of source material that proved especially useful for your research?
The one that comes to mind for me that was really a breakthrough was learning about Judge Bolin in New York and finding her oral history. Thankfully, someone had collected an oral history interview with her, and she really unpacks in great detail how she was working to affect change, and also some of the things that were happening around her in New York City, which gave me, that account provided useful insights, but it also gave me a number of directions to go in terms of looking at other kinds of material that might speak to, for example, how the NAACP or the Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who are contemporaries of hers, were simultaneously working on some of these things and to develop a narrative around that. So I think that's the main one. And another another thing that was really just incredibly valuable to me, and I should say this more. I should have said this at the outset, really, when I was talking about some of the early kind of provocations that led to this historical focus. I had a colleague at Howard University, historically Black college, who, I was at Howard's archive to look at, Howard, as a Black university, has collections related to the African American experience, and I was looking at some of those, including NAACP records, and she, I remember how we knew each other, but I went to see her in her office while I was there, and she was, said, "What are you working on?" I told her, and she said, "Oh, well, this might be useful to you." She reaches in her desk and pulls out this pamphlet about a Black women's club from the late 1800s that is organizing to address unequal juvenile, disparity in juvenile justice. And she says, maybe you can do something with this. I've been holding on to it because I wanted to do something with it, but I'm going to retire. So you should take it, and maybe you can find something to do. Maybe it'll be useful. And at that point, I didn't know. That was the first time I had learned anything about African American mobilization around this issue, this history. So it's there was no. There are collections I came to find later related to Black club women that were somewhat useful, but they tend to be scattered. They'll be organized by these groups were organized locally and then regionally, and then at the state level, then regional, then national. And the national records are not particularly useful for some of the understanding of what's happening in local communities. And to get the local records, if they exist at all, you have to go to all the local communities where they might have been preserved. So I didn't really spend a lot of time, with those collections. I imagine they would be more useful. I did find some, in the, like the St. Louis Historical Society might have something about the Sojourner Truth Club. But the main thing I wanted to just share was that just, that generosity and, and just talking with people about what I was doing and that she didn't hoard it. A lot of people I know in academia are like, hoarders. And not in a like they fill their house with things, that too probably, but like they want they're thirsty for the fame, and they want to be the one to say it or to write it. And she was like, here, this is interesting, which is just a very generous, collaborative spirit. I think that one of the biggest weaknesses of my work, really, here and elsewhere, has been around the intersectional lens. I think I do not great in this book with dealing with intersectionality, just in terms of race, ethnicity, gender. There's a little bit, about Black girls and as intersectionality as relates to their ordeals that became available, that I learned about through, again, these like one-off reports. Somebody from University of North Carolina wrote a report on the history of the North Carolina system that included this, incredible passage section. But things like disability, things like, disaggregating Blackness, for example, within the U.S. context, you have Afro-Caribbean populations, you have recent African immigrant populations, you have a diverse African diaspora within this national context. Is similarly the case with the UK, and there's no real engagement with those sorts of intersections. So the last thing, the silences, full of silences, the archives on these histories. I mean, the biggest silence, I think, is the voices of young people themselves in terms of their experiences. Almost always, these experiences are mediated through the accounts and the agendas of adults around them. There is this interesting book. I don't know if you all are familiar with this. There is I'll try to find the title of it, but there's a recently discovered and published autobiography of a young man who was confined in several institutions in the 19th century in the U.S., African American, and it's sort of a semi-fictional biography. It's a fascinating text, but it was published just maybe, I don't know, everything feels like a few years ago. It's probably like 10 years ago. And I can see if I can find it and share. And there's some other fragments, like there's a note. I don't remember where I found it, but I didn't find the note, but someone wrote about a note an African-American girl left in her Bible who was confined in Missouri, and where she is protesting the abuse she's experiencing at this institution. So there are these fragments, but I think those are the biggest silence. I mean, there are huge silences around the African American experience and other group experiences, for that matter. There has been some work recently on Latinos in the West, I think particularly Mexican American experiences in California historically, but there hasn't been, there hasn't been much work along these lines otherwise.
Thank you for that. Guys, do we have any further questions? I'm trying to see if there are any hands raised in the chat. I see that there is no questions, so I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask a further question. So to what extent, I'll just put a provocation out there. The whole idea, I work with this idea of the challenge the idea that the system is broken. When we think about the inequalities that perpetuate or reproduce themselves, often you hear narratives that say, well, the system is broken, it simply doesn't work. And so one of the things that, in looking at history enables that a more critical conclusion about the system. The system, in fact, is structured. It's quite well structured, and we might say it does not, it's quite exclusive in the sense that it is structured to marginalize. But do you think that the system is broken, or do you think that in that sense that the system is exactly the way it was constructed to be?
Well, I think it's both, and I mean, I'm sorry, I know that probably seems like a cop out, but I think it is both, because I think it is, all of our systems are contested systems. They're designed in some ways, and then they're contested and changed, and not in a, I don't mean that in a kind of, constant progress story, but they are, the rule of law, generally speaking, is a system that is broken, but that we try to make work relative to our various interests, and so I think that the youth justice system, as I've shown, as I think the work has shown, was designed to reproduce inequality, but it was also changed to in an attempt to reproduce greater equality of opportunity, and it was changed again in ways that reproduced inequality, and this goes on and on. So I think it's these are systems that we are we inherit. They're structures we inherit, and we in every generation is posed with the question, what do we do with this? How do we make it work? How do we make it align better with our values? And our values, every generation's values, are heterogeneous, right? We're competing with each other to shape the values that inform things like immigration law, or reproductive rights, or the list goes on and is endless. And the systems we have in place to affect those debates are broken, and they're constantly being contested. And I mean, this is, I think, partly why you see in this country not only this never-ending effort to limit access to voting rights, but also to limit access to information, like African American history education or critical race theory. Bans on book banning that is happening in this country. The parents and the far right are, attempting to prevent people from understanding things like the history and legacy of slavery, such so that they won't have the capacity to make certain kinds of demands on the state or each other. But it's contested. So I don't know. That's why I land on both.
I mean, we can go back and forth for sure. There's an argument to be made for the fact that now with the sort of neoliberal incursion that everyone is feeling the strain. But I can't help thinking of the fact that we have now produced more billionaires, and we're sort of praising and suggesting that this is a fantastically good thing in a time where there's such tremendous inequality. Guys, I don't want to take too much of the floor, so I'll ask one final time if there are any other questions that we can ask Geoff. I see a hand. Roberto Catello.
Sorry, Jeffrey. Thanks for this talk. Really interesting. I hesitated to ask a question earlier because the question I wanted to ask you, you kind of addressed about what sort of lessons we can learn from history, how useful historical research actually is when it comes to policy and informing theory. And but so I'll ask a different question if you don't mind, which is because I've heard you, I'm not particularly familiar with your work around representative social control, but I just couldn't help thinking about the progressive penal policy of Scandinavian countries that very much influenced by an abolitionist sort of impetus in the late 60s and 70s ultimately abolished youth justice altogether. And so I was thinking, but that's, to me, that's the way you deal with the broken system, regardless of whether this is a broken system or it was designed to be this way. I guess that's a question that turned out to be relevant in the Scandinavian case, and they just said, well, we need to abolish this negative form of institutionalized social control and replace it with positive ones, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
First among them, sort of an expansive foresight, and so. And so I wonder why you tend towards this kind of notion of representative social control, which I take retains an element of negativity. And so the way I'm picturing it, but maybe I'm wrong, is that you diversify the apparatus of social control, but you retain sort of its repressive, you retain the repressive structure intact. And I was just wondering if you could address that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I first of all, when I use the term social control very specifically to mean the definition and enforcement of norms, and this includes, informal control, the way society engages in control around the sort of both defining norms and enforcing them. Those include informal social control measures. I forget the sociologists who write about this, but and also formal social control measures, and the most repressive systems, we think about are of course the formal control, social control measures. But I think I use the term because I think it is sort of comprehensive. It doesn't presume a repressive approach to the definition and enforcement of norms, though we're most familiar with that approach because we've lived in societies dominated by that approach, and because we've, I think I think there are other models that we don't know as much about because they've not been canonized and celebrated in sort of, in the ways that, I mean, you just shared an example of one. So that's the first thing. And I'm assuming, sort of from a philosophical perspective, if you think about like John Rawls' theory of justice, or which I'm not, it has limitations, but I'm assuming that people, if in fact there was a representative system of social control, people would not support a repressive model. But we don't have representative systems. We have systems that have been designed to serve the interests of the powerful, the elite, the propertied, and so forth. So that's why I use that language. I also think that and this is an issue, that I run into. There's been a lot of discussion in this country around the abolition of policing, for example, or the abolition of prisons. And I'm not opposed to the abolition of repressive systems, but I do think that societies, by definition, engage in social control. They are held together by notions of norms, what is decent and acceptable, and some enforcement of those norms seems to me inevitable in a society. So maybe the term social control is so polluted, that like is so weighed down by negative implications that we should abandon it and use something. We need a new word, a new phrase. But I do think that we will inevitably, societies inevitably engage in some definition of what is acceptable and some enforcement of those regulation of, those norms. And I've just been interested really in the question of is there a way for that to be more representative, and what does that look like? And so I hope that clarifies where I'm coming from with this.
Roberto.
Sorry, absolutely, Geoff. I get it, and yeah, and I get your point about social control. I guess that's the point I was trying to get at, is that precisely by looking at the criminal justice system, the history of criminal law, and so on, you realize that all these institutions, in a way, are failing institutions. It doesn't matter which institution you look at. You look at the issue of providing, the history, they all fail by their own standards and aims. Which is why what I was trying to imply is that is whether there's an extent to which historical evidence actually lends itself quite well to abolitionist causes. Not just the abolition of youth justice in Scandinavia in the 70s was part of a broader program of penal abolition, and the ones advocating for that abolitionist program knew what you said about social control being an inevitable part of the way we organize societies today. But the point is to shift away from negative social controls to positive social controls. Whereas what I was sort of reading or kind of taking from what you were saying is that it's actually worthwhile putting our efforts into bringing representation into our current model of negative social control. So that's why I was kind of but yes, I'm more. Yeah, please.
Yeah, well, let me just say, I think so I think about this continuum of inclusionary to exclusionary kinds of sanctions. We think about the enforcement of norms. There are approaches that are designed to build stronger connections to the social body and capacities to thrive in the society, which I'm calling inclusionary sanctions, and there are exclusionary. There's an exclusionary end that at the extreme eliminates your existence in the society through things like death or banishment, and through long terms of incarceration where you're separated and so forth. I think that I'm all in favor of inclusionary approaches. I think that there are some examples historically and today of those approaches, and you've mentioned one, but what I was describing earlier was my well, two things. One is I think there's a project in the United States called the Square One Project, Square One Justice. You might be interested, check it out. It's called Square One Justice. And the basic question is, if we can go to square one to rethink justice, what would we do? Which is, an interesting question. But because I'm a historical sociologist, my brain won't even go to this notion of a square one. We can't go to square one. We are where we are at this square we are at. And how do we get from where we are to a society where I think it's a worthwhile thought experiment, to be clear, because we need ideas. We need ideas for what comes after abolition, or through abolition. But how do we get there? And to me, part of the answer to that is inevitably going to involve our existing structures, like legislatures and courts, and I think that we we don't get to a world with committed to inclusionary social control strategies without administrative bodies of all sorts that can carry out that agenda, that can really bring that agenda to the fore and translate it into things like into policy and practice and funding and that sort of thing. But I wasn't even in my work on this. I've not been really operating at that level of analysis. I've been really asking, because these women I'm writing about thought, well, we're going to take positions. My mother she's retired now, is an African American woman. She was a lawyer her whole career, who for part of it worked for the police in Los Angeles, who terrorized my brother and I as we were growing up. I used to ask her, what are you doing? They're horrible. How do you work with them? And she would say, well, if it's not me, it's going to be someone else. And I bring these stories to bear, and I bring kind of pressures to bear, and so forth, the kind of change from within story. And I wanted to, as years later, particularly in the wake of this work on the Black child savers, who themselves thought, well, if we can take positions, in the legislature, in the courts, in the trenches, policing and elsewhere, then we can essentially institutionalize Black child saving. And I thought, well, I was, obviously doubtful that it clearly wasn't happening. But I wanted to see, it is an empirical question that I wanted to begin to sort of make sense of. Well, what is happening? What does happen when you see more representative legal authority in a particular jurisdiction? And so we started doing studies of federal courts and attitudes among juvenile decision makers, justice decision makers, and so forth. And so it's very modest. The work I was doing along those lines was very modestly kind of looking at what a more representative system of legal authority, as it exists now, the legal authority exists now, what it looks like. And we did see some evidence of meaningful difference, but bound by the overwhelming retributive prerogatives of these systems. Like our federal system in this country has these mandatory sentencing structures, and with very little room for departure. But we see evidence that first, people are getting extremely punitive outcomes in these courts, but that what happens in more representative districts is that the benefits white defendants have enjoyed relative to Black defendants in districts without Black prosecutorial representation diminish when you have Black prosecutorial representation. You have a more equal distribution of the pain of the punitive state in those representative contexts. Now, this is not my ideal, but I think it's an interesting finding that might in fact make more white Americans come to a place where they say, "Hey, wait a minute," and after you've seen this, when white youth started experiencing some of this moral panic, super predator moral panic, tough on crime sentencing, the parents were coming out and saying, wait a minute, white families were coming out, and later legislatures coming out, oh, we didn't mean for this to be affecting white kids. So I think those kinds of outcomes can move a society potentially to a place where it abandons these things. The last thing I just want to say, about I think there has been a call to abolish the juvenile court in the U.S. context, to abolish the juvenile jurisdiction. And people like Barry Feld have written about this. I wonder why, I'm curious about the Scandinavian case, but I think it seems to me that the adult system might be the one to abandon. and some of the principles of, limited culpability, presumption of a right to developmental opportunities and resources and so forth, should be what we seek to preserve, not through institutionalization, obviously, but I was always curious, like, why, if we're going to abolish a jurisdiction, why the one that seems to have at least the ingredients for a more fundamental commitment to inclusionary sanctions. In his argument, just to finish the point, Barry Feld's argument is that, all of these, I'm paraphrasing, but all of these, social well-being intentions are vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, and the best thing we can do is provide due process to everyone, and that's what you get in the adult system. But I really do appreciate the question. I know I'm going on too long. I see Marie about to tell me to shut up.
No. I'm gonna say thank you very much. Thank you for the questions and thank you for your responses. I'm going to stop the recording. I think we've moved a little past, but this is absolutely wonderful because you guys have stayed with us, and Geoff, you have stayed and given responses that are absolutely phenomenal and insightful, absolutely insightful. I like the fact that we went outside the discipline and drew on things from, especially that I have so much affinity with the idea of distributive politics, the idea positive rights versus negative rights, the implications that these have for our concerns about neutrality, especially in the context of modernity. And I really like the idea that you suggest, you brought up that, that we are a society, and by virtue of being a society, we have social controls because we have these ideas around norms because we're trying to attain a sense of stability. And if you think of the Hobbesian perspective that we are kind of chaotic and we need to be governed. So, we do inherit systems. So the thing is, what do we do? Like, how can we conceptualize a system that actually does what it says it's doing? Because it says it's doing it, right? It says we are trying to be equal. We're trying to ensure universal equality. So it's not saying we're trying to ensure equality for some. It's saying we're moving away from that differentiation and we're trying to do the real donkey work here. But the CRT perspective points out that interests need to align for that universality to be really actualized. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop the recording and say once again,